Hey everybody, welcome to What the Flick. Bibbs, Alonso, Ben here. So sad news over the weekend. Wes Craven, 76 years old, died of brain cancer.
Yeah.
I guess because, well, I don't guess anything. Horror was never my genre as a kid growing up, if we have genres as kids. What did he mean to you guys?
I'll let Bibbs field this one because I'm not so much the horror guy either.
I'm the horror guy here. Wes Craven was often called a master of horror, and I think that's fair. I also think he was just plain a master of cinema. And what he brought to the table with his films, particularly films like Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Scream, and Wes Craven's New Nightmare, was intelligence.
Yeah.
He brought to his films, because the horror, there were classy horror films like Rosemary's Baby, and then there were junk horror films that were just filling the grindhouse theaters, and then there was Wes Craven, who managed to take a lot of the tropes, a lot of the things we expected from just violent schlock, and he brought absolute intelligence to them. He brought social relevance to them. This man, he was a professor. He was a professor of humanities and English and psychology. He did not make dumb movies. Everything he did brought intelligence and wit to it.
I think there's a really interesting mix with him because he does come from that academic background. And so you have a movie like Last House on the Left that is, on the one hand, a total gut bucket grindhouse movie that is vile in a lot of ways. It's hard to watch. And it's a remake of Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring. Ta-da!
Sights and sounds far beyond anything you've tested. The Last House on the Left. To avoid fainting, keep repeating. It's only a movie. Only a movie. Only a movie.
You can't dismiss it out of hand, and certainly there's a craftsmanship going on there, even though that's a really, a hard film to look at. And before, I think people talked as much about sort of postmodernism and meta-narrative, he was really playing around with that stuff, not just in the Scream movies where you had people dealing with sort of a self-aware cinematic universe, but especially in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which is one of the scariest movies I've ever seen because it really kind of, it removes that fourth wall and it places you into a film where Craven is playing himself and Heather Langenkamp is playing herself and all these people are playing themselves. And so you don't have that veneer of fiction to cling to when things start getting scary.
And that could have been cute and cloying and really trite. And instead, he made a very valid point about what horror was, what horror represented, and how if we don't have an outlet for the things that terrify us, the real world suffers.
That's what the nightmares are telling me, and that's what I'm writing.
This is still a script we're talking about, right, Wes?
He's decided to cross over out of films into art reality. The only way to stop him is to make another movie.
Oh my God.
Even in some of his lesser films, he was playing around with that. If you look at a film like Shocker, which is not a great movie, but even in Shocker, it has this incredible climactic sequence in which this very schlocky, very silly horror movie starts bounding from one TV station to another. They actually project themselves into our entertainment, and this horrifying element just permeates through every single thing we watch. And there's a lot of intelligence there. Now, Wes Craven, like a lot of great directors, he made a lot of crap. And don't watch Deadly Blessing. If you're going to do a marathon of Wes Craven's film, Deadly Blessing is not the way to go. But when even his failures were interesting failures, and when he was on his game, he was incredible. And there's several of his films that never really found an audience at the time that are only recently starting to really become appreciated. A film like People Under the Stairs.
Sure. But what goes on under the stairs is a nightmare.
He made a lot of films about social sort of injustice, or at the very least, the idea of violence and the way it affects the urban mindset. That the outrage you can sense in People Under the Stairs about issues like the 1%, about the issues of the moral majority and authority, and the enormous hypocrisies inherent to that. And yeah, he managed to throw in mutilated cannibal children as well. That was the thing.
Why not?
Because he took a genre that was fun and hokey and he imbued it with more intelligence than people were used to the extent that when, Roger Ebert, the great Roger Ebert, he praised The Last House on the Left, even as he completely ignored and damned I Spit on Your Grave, movies that are very, very similar and arguably equal
Well, you just
caliber.
see all you have to do is watch Last House on the Left and then watch the remake.
I was
of
just going to
Last
say
House
the
on the Left.
remake totally.
Yeah, and you see
lets
how
you see the difference.
they're both awful and ugly in some ways. Not awful in the
They're
way,
about awful,
manner, the
yeah,
way,
yeah.
but they're about awful things, and there's a way you can feel awful, and you could be disgusted by both. But one has a sensibility. It has a thoughtfulness about it, whereas the second one is
just schlock, yeah.
just a horrible thing to watch.
Well, and you look at the first Last House on the Left was made with this really powerful docudrama aesthetic that was very much inspired by the footage we were getting from Vietnam at the time on the nightly news. So the idea is here is violence at home portrayed with the exact same amount of gravitas, and then he would juxtapose it with this incredibly atonal comic relief with these wacky sheriffs who are completely incapable of helping. And it's hard not to see that as it's a blunt and maybe not entirely successful comment, but it's a comment about your
Authority figures.
It's about authority figures, but it's also about our entertainment. It's also about the way we're looking at horror movies. Like, oh, isn't it silly, this horror movie? It's like, no, this horror is serious business. Horror, when we look at the way that people brutalize each other in fiction, when we detract from that, when we try to make that more palatable, we are actually doing a disservice.
Right, but the irony, of course, is that horror at its worst does more of a disservice to that than almost any other genre.
Yeah, that could be argued.
Yeah, I mean, so by saying, no, look, it is really horrible, eventually you get inured to it, and if it's not well weighed, if it feels schlocky, then that's sort of the most, the thing I object to most is in movies is the lack of consequences to violence. Not punishment for the perpetrators, but the lack of emotional consequences for those surrounding.
That's what like Funny Games is about.
Right.
Like,
And that's
really,
what
you want to see this?
And that's what New Nightmare was about.
Absolutely,
New Nightmare was about the idea.
true.
I created this incredible. It's a little self-serving, but he created this incredible boogeyman in Freddy Krueger, who represented the sins of our parents. He represented child murder. He represented all of these incredibly potent anxieties. And then over the course of about 6 sequels, he became a joke. He had rap albums. He was cute.
Yeah.
And that robbed a very serious commentary about the things that scare us and should scare us of all of its power. And then he tried to inject it back. Yeah. And that was very relevant, I think.
Market, common market. I'm doing a film about my nightmares as I'm dreaming them. In order for the movie to continue, it was dependent on me having more nightmares. Well, fortunately, I did.
We were talking before about, comparing him to Woody Allen in terms of being prolific.
Yeah.
And that it sort of allowed him to kind of experiment and fail and throw ideas out. And there was some interesting pieces when Aloha came out this year, talking about filmmakers like Cameron Crowe or James L. Brooks who wait 5 or 6 years between movies, and so they kind of fuss themselves to death. Whereas I think you look at Craven's career, and it's an argument for sort of like just put him out there and be working on the next one and be thinking about things and get them done.
You know who's doing it in that vein? Who's taking 3, 4, 5 years to make a movie and doing it correctly? It would appear would be Alexander Payne.
Sure. Yeah,
Sure.
no, it's not
Yeah,
necessarily
it's
a
not
bad
like-
thing.
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
true.
Or Tarantino is another one as well.
Tarantino seems like a different kind of category, but
Right.
yeah.
So, all right, music of the heart, yay or nay?
Terrifying.
It's not his best. I will say this, whenever people counted Craven out.
But it's interesting that
But
it
it's interesting
exists.
that it exists and that he did it and it was important to
It's
him.
an
yeah.
Oscar-nominated
Yeah,
film.
no, it's okay.
He
It's all right.
tried to break out, and he never quite did. But every time we counted him out, it was like, we want to do this every time. It's like the rule of threes. You make 3 bad movies in a row, audiences and often many critics like, oh, Cameron Crowe. Oh, Aloha? Well, I didn't like his previous 2 films, so fuck him. Like, no, that's terrible. And every single time people counted Wes Craven out, he came roaring back with a new and incredibly relevant film. He took when he did Scream, slasher movies were dead. Even horror fans didn't give a damn.
I remember going into Scream, like being pulled into Scream. Like, I don't want to see this. I got no interest in this, nothing. And then you come out thinking, well, what was that?
Yeah.
That was fantastic.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
Is that the one where the guy had knives for fingers?
Yeah, Freddy Krueger.
Freddy, that's right. I like that movie. It was scary.
Well, the first one was, but the rest sucked.
I've actually argued on many occasions that Scream is actually like the defining film of my generation.
Oh yeah,
the teenagers
no.
in the 90s.
I think for I think the whole sort of so much of the attitude of the 1990s and so much of our approach to entertainment springs out of Scream, and I would maybe argue the Larry Sanders Show. You know, I think those two things really kind of blurred the lines and were very self-aware and created this idea of the meta-narrative.
They kickstarted something valuable.
Yeah.
Well, I think
that
more
we're
than
still in the middle of.
I think more than kickstarting it, I think they commented on what was already there, which is a generation of people who are influenced by what they watched, not necessarily what they lived, and that both empowered and weakened them.
Sure.
And on top of that whole, it's a really potent narrative about women. If you look at the original Scream trilogy, it is about a woman who cheated on her husband, and all of the enormous, outrage and overreaction to that ended up getting a bunch of people killed, and then her daughter has to end up answering for all of the crimes of a generation that didn't even commit any crimes. It's an interesting narrative that people do not talk about.
That description of Scream makes me think, wait a minute, did I see Scream?
Yeah. It's all about Sydney's mom.
No, you're right. That's an interesting thing. And we also talked about this. 4, I think, is better than people give it credit for being.
2 and 4 are rock solid, and
I like 3. I will hoist myself on that petard. I thought 3 was fun.
3 has Last Crusade syndrome, where I think it got too jokey for its own good, but it's still fun. And Parker Posey is so amazing in it that I don't care about any of its flaws.
Very quickly, just for me, I couldn't have seen it when it came out. I was 10. There's no way anyone would have let that happen. But whatever young age I was when I saw The Hills Have Eyes, that stayed with me. That made an impact.
And
that may have put me off those movies.
It was just
too effectively terrifying.
The Hills Have Eyes.
There's so many movies like The Hills Have Eyes about urbanites who go to an area where all of the adjustments they've had to make to succeed in an urban, civilized world are useless, and then they are preyed upon by those who are more savage.
Right.
Craven was one of the filmmakers and storytellers who said, and the urbanites have it in them too, and that they can survive and they become just as savage. And isn't that sad?
Definitely.
It's like a grindhouse straw dogs. Like it's so impossible not to be affected by it.
And it's another movie I think that like as with Last House on the Left that becomes even better when you see
when you see an attempt to make it more modern. Yeah.
And that's actually not one of the worst remakes. When you look
but it's not nearly as bad as The Last House on the Left.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's not nearly as bad as Nightmare on Elm Street, which is just
you're right.
Useless remake.
God, all 3 of those got remade. Yeah.
Yeah, it's stay away from Wes Craven. Basically, just let it be.
And
if you want to do Deadly Blessing, knock yourself out. I'm dead serious. That movie is so bad.
And we're in the middle of we've been recapping MTV's Scream, and it's a somewhat different animal.
It's a very different animal, I think.
So I think it's far enough off the away from the original to not necessarily brook comparison. Yes, obviously it's not going to have the impact of the original, series and all that kind of stuff. But I think for a television program trying to work some of those same ideas, it's not unsuccessful.
Also, we're seeing it's just as we're getting. He was 76 years old, and as we, how old is Woody? 80 now, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And we're living in this sort of world of, consistent medical miracles, and it's nothing to live to 90. 76, I don't know, even 10 years ago, 76 to me felt like, full life.
Sure,
right?
But
76
you're right.
now feels like
too early.
Robbed of 10 to 15 reasonable years.
Absolutely.
Certainly 5 to 10 working years.
Yeah,
I mean, Eastwood is still cranking them out.
And I don't know who is around now. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in horror right now, but I think this is one of those guys that we pass this way but once.
Yeah, no. When we've got a few of the titans left from the era when Wes Craven got started. We got Dario Argento still kicking around, John Carpenter, George A. Romero, but we're going to reach to the point now where we're lucky if we have them for more than a few more decades. Yeah. Just the odds, the odds of them living to be 120 or
and I'm saying that even among the new guys, there's nobody who brings to the table the sort of mix of influences and background that Craven brought that made him so unique.
Certainly not yet. Anyway, certainly no one who's reached a certain amount of heights. But there's a lot of brilliant filmmakers out there, and I look forward to seeing which of them can become the next master of horror.
All right. So yes, R.I.P. Mr. Craven. Thank you for all the great movies, and thank you for joining us.